She stood shivering in the freezing mud, publicly rejected by the man she loved, her tears mixing with the bitter rain. But before the pack could violently cast her out, the ground trembled. The Alpha King himself stepped from his carriage, his piercing gaze locking on to her. "Pack your things," he ordered. The year was 1342, and the iron-grey sky over the northern territories of the Harrington Pack promised nothing but snow and misery. The courtyard of the Pack's stone keep was a slurry of frozen mud-horse dung and crushed hay. It was not a place of romance, nor was it the setting for fairy tales. It was a harsh, unforgiving reality, where survival meant everything, and weakness was a death sentence. Genevieve Miller knelt in the center of the muck, her thin linen dress clinging to her shivering frame. She was an Omega. In the old songs, Omegas were cherished, protected, as the heart of the Pack, the peacekeepers. But in the brutal reality of the medieval Packlands, Omegas were the lowest caste. They were the kitchen maids, the floor scrubbers, the ones who ate the scraps left behind by the enforcers. Genevieve had accepted her lot in life with a quiet grace. She had to. Her father had died of the sweating sickness 3 winters ago, and she was entirely alone. But then the unthinkable had happened. 2 nights prior, during the Harvest Moon Festival, she had bumped into Oliver Crawford. Oliver was the son of the reigning Alpha, a man bred for war with broad shoulders and a reputation for cold, tactical brilliance. When their hands brushed over a spilled flagon of ale, the bond snapped into place with the force of a lightning strike. Genevieve had felt the sudden, intoxicating rush of a mate bond. For a fleeting, foolish moment, Oliver's eyes had gone wide, flashing with the golden light of their inner wolves, recognizing each other. He had pulled her into the shadows of the armory, pressing feverish kisses to her neck, whispering that he would protect her. It was a lie born of momentary instinct. Now, 48 hours later, she was kneeling in the freezing rain while the entire pack surrounded her, forming a tight, suffocating ring. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool wood smoke and the sour tang of impending cruelty. Oliver stood before her, not as the feverish lover in the armory, but as the heir to the Harrington Pack. Beside him stood Lady Beatrice of the formidable Ironwood territory. Beatrice was an alpha female, tall, wrapped in expensive fox furs, her chin tilted in an expression of sheer disdain as she looked down at Genevieve. The Harrington Pack was losing a border war against rogue scavengers. They needed the Ironwood army. Oliver needed an alliance, not a frail, dirt-smudged Omega mate. Genevieve Miller. Oliver's voice rang out harsh and unyielding, bouncing off the damp stone walls of the keep. He didn't look into her eyes. He couldn't. "I, Oliver Crawford, future Alpha of the Harrington Pack, formally and utterly reject you as my mate." The words were not just a social declaration. They were a biological weapon. A visceral, agonizing tear ripped through Genevieve's chest. It felt as though a rusted blade had been shoved between her ribs, hooking into her soul and pulling it out of her throat. Genevieve gasped, her hands flying to her chest as she collapsed forward into the freezing mud. A harsh, wet cough racked her small body, and a splatter of dark blood painted the icy ground beneath her. The crowd watched in silence. Some expressions held pity, but most held a cold indifference. This was the way of their world: duty over desire, power over destiny. I accept your rejection." Genevieve choked out the ancient mandatory words tasting like ash and iron on her tongue. The moment she spoke them, the agonizing severing of their bond was complete. The golden thread that had briefly connected their spirits snapped, leaving behind a hollow, rotting void in her chest. "By the laws of our ancestors," Oliver continued, his voice wavering for only a fraction of a second before hardening into stone. A rejected Omega has no place within the stronghold of their former mate. You are a distraction. You are an exile. You have until the sun touches the western pines to gather what little you own and leave these lands. If you are found within our borders by nightfall, you will be hunted." Beatrice smirked, leaning closer to Oliver and threading her arm through his. "A generous timeline, my love," she murmured loud enough for the front row of the crowd to hear. "I would have thrown the little rat to the hounds immediately." Genevieve pushed herself up on trembling arms, her knees coated in thick, freezing mud. Her friend Mary, a fellow servant, wept silently from the edge of the crowd, but dared not step forward. To help an exile was to invite the Alpha's wrath. Genevieve didn't look at Oliver again. She couldn't bear to see the emptiness where her mate should have been. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, ignoring the biting wind, and began the humiliating walk back to the servants' quarters. The crowd parted for her, pulling their cloaks aside, as if her rejection were a contagious disease. She had nothing. A wooden comb her mother had carved, a single silver coin she had hoarded for 5 years, and a ragged woolen blanket. That was the entirety of her life's accumulation. As she packed these pitiful items into a canvas sack, the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy shroud. The northern woods in the dead of winter were swarming with rogue wolves, bandits, and freezing temperatures. A lone, weakened Omega wouldn't survive 3 days. Oliver hadn't just rejected her, he had effectively sentenced her to a slow, freezing death in the wilderness. Genevieve tied the rough hemp rope around her canvas sack, her fingers stiff and blue from the cold. The bleeding in her chest had slowed to a dull, throbbing ache, but her inner wolf whimpered in absolute despair, curled tightly into a ball within the recesses of her mind. She hoisted the sack onto her shoulder and stepped out of the servants' keep. She intended to slip out through the postern gate, avoiding the main thoroughfare and the cruel jeers of the pack members. But as she stepped into the alleyway, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks. It was the deep, resonant blast of a war horn, cutting through the gloomy afternoon air like a physical blow. Then came another, and another. 3 blasts. Genevieve's breath hitched. 3 blasts meant only one thing. The High Crown had arrived. Panic erupted in the courtyard. The Harringtons were a proud pack, but they were minor lords compared to the monstrous power of the Alpha King, King Nathaniel of the House of Lancaster, known in whispered, terrified breaths across the kingdoms as the Blood King, ruled the combined western and northern territories with an iron fist. He was not a king who sat on a velvet throne. He was a warlord who slept in armor and drank from the skulls of treasonous alphas. Rumor said he was pushing 40, remained mateless, and was growing increasingly unstable, his beast constantly fighting for control. Genevieve pressed herself against the cold stone of the armory wall, hoping to remain unseen. She just wanted to leave. But the postern gate was locked, heavily guarded now, by panicked sentries trying to secure the perimeter for the royal arrival. She was trapped in the inner bailey. The massive iron portcullis was raised with a shrieking grind of metal on stone. Through the archway rode a vanguard of heavily armored warriors on massive destriers. They wore pitch-black cloaks over boiled leather and chainmail, their faces obscured by grim steel helms. And then he rode in. King Nathaniel didn't ride a horse. He rode a massive, scarred draft beast that looked more monster than equine. The king himself was a terrifying sight. He was a mountain of a man clad in dark steel armor, etched with ancient runic wards. A thick grey direwolf pelt was draped over his broad shoulders. He pulled off his helm, revealing a face composed of sharp angles, a square jaw covered in a dark shadow of a beard and a jagged white scar that cut through his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. But it was his eyes that struck terror into the hearts of the Harrington pack. They were a piercing, unnatural shade of icy blue, entirely devoid of warmth. Oliver and his father, the current alpha, scrambled into the mud of the courtyard, dropping to their knees in frantic submission. Beatrice, losing all her previous haughty composure, threw herself into a deep, trembling curtsy. The entire pack exposed their necks, terrified of the legendary predator in their midst. "Your Grace." Oliver's father stammered, his forehead practically touching the mud. We did not expect you. We would have prepared a feast. King Nathaniel held up a single, gauntleted hand. The silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. Even the horses seemed afraid to breathe. "I haven't come for your miserable roasted pigs, Crawford." Nathaniel's voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It held an undeniable crushing authority. "I am returning from the southern campaigns. My men require shelter for the night. You will provide it." "Of course, sire, at once." Nathaniel swung his massive frame down from his beast, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy thud. He began to walk toward the main keep, his enforcers flanking him. But after 3 steps, he stopped. The Alpha King froze entirely. His broad chest expanded as he drew in a slow, deep breath through his nose. The icy blue of his eyes flickered, bleeding into a terrifying, luminous crimson. His inner wolf had surfaced violently and without warning. Genevieve, hiding in the shadows of the alleyway 50 yards away, felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt. The hollow, rotting void in her chest where her mate bond had been severed suddenly sparked with a strange, terrifying heat. It wasn't the warm, blossoming feeling she had experienced with Oliver. It felt dangerous, heavy, and completely overwhelming. Nathaniel turned his head slowly, his crimson gaze scanning the kneeling pack members. He ignored Oliver. He ignored the Alpha. He ignored the shivering Beatrice. His eyes locked onto the dark alleyway. He locked onto Genevieve. "You!" Nathaniel growled the sound, sending a wave of primal fear through the courtyard. Several Omegas whined in terror, pressing themselves flat against the ground. He changed his trajectory, stalking past the kneeling nobles like they were nothing more than furniture. He walked straight toward the alleyway. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She tried to step back to run, but her legs refused to obey. The sheer, suffocating aura of the king's dominance pinned her to the stone wall. Nathaniel stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, he was even more massive. He smelled of rain, pine needles, dried blood, and ozone, the scent of a brewing thunderstorm. He looked down at her, taking in her bruised, tear-stained face, the mud caking her knees, and the pitiful canvas sack clutched to her chest. He noted the fresh, unnatural paleness of her skin, the telltale physical sign of a freshly broken mate bond. "What is your name?" he demanded, his voice low, vibrating with a tightly coiled tension. Genevieve, your grace." She whispered, her voice barely audible. She kept her eyes glued to his muddy boots, exposing her neck in desperate submission. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He turned his head, slightly glaring over his shoulder at the Harrington Alpha and Oliver, who were watching in horrified confusion. "Who rejected her?" Nathaniel's voice echoed across the silent courtyard, laced with a lethal promise. Oliver swallowed hard, his face draining of color. I did, sire. She is a low-ranking Omega. I require a strong mate for the upcoming border skirmishes." "Silence," Nathaniel snapped. The word cracked like a whip, and Oliver immediately snapped his mouth shut, whimpering slightly, as the king's aura forced him lower into the mud. Nathaniel turned his attention back to Genevieve. He reached out his massive calloused hand, moving toward her face. Genevieve flinched, squeezing her eyes shut, expecting a blow. Instead, a large, surprisingly warm finger tilted her chin up, forcing her to look into his terrifying crimson eyes. "You have been exiled?" he asked. Genevieve nodded once, a single tear escaping her eye and rolling over his thumb. Nathaniel stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The savage, bloodthirsty king, who had supposedly executed an entire pack for insubordination a month prior, was looking at a broken, mud-stained Omega with an intensity that made the air crackle. "Your sack is packed," Nathaniel stated, his crimson eyes never leaving hers. Yes, sire. I was leaving." Nathaniel dropped his hand from her chin. He took a step back, his massive cloak swirling around his boots. He looked back at Oliver, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his scarred face. Then he looked back at Genevieve. "Pack your things," the Alpha King ordered, his voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable finality. "And come with me." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the courtyard. Oliver Crawford's jaw went slack, his eyes darting between the towering, terrifying figure of the Alpha King and the trembling Omega he had just discarded like garbage. Genevieve stood frozen, her fingers digging into the rough canvas of her sack. "Your Grace," Oliver choked out his voice, cracking entirely, stripping him of his masculine pride. She is but a servant, a broken Omega. She will only slow your march." Nathaniel did not even turn his head to acknowledge the boy. He kept his crimson gaze locked on Genevieve. "Commander Harrison." The king barked, the deep timbre of his voice vibrating against the stone walls. A massive warrior, second only to the king in size, stepped forward from the vanguard. He possessed a scarred jawline and cold, assessing grey eyes. "Sire, put her in my personal carriage. Wrap her in the sable furs. If she shivers even once, I will hold you personally responsible." Harrison bowed deeply, hiding his own surprise. "At once, my king." Genevieve was too stunned to fight, too broken to resist. She was swept away by Commander Harrison, guided past the gaping, horrified faces of her former pack. Lady Beatrice stood with her mouth ajar, her expensive fox furs suddenly looking cheap in the shadow of the king's retinue. As Genevieve was helped into a massive iron-reinforced carriage lined with plush velvet and furs, the heavy door slammed shut, sealing her in a world of alien luxury. The heat inside, radiating from a small iron stove, made her violently shiver as her freezing body began to thaw. Outside, she heard the heavy thud of Nathaniel's boots as he approached Oliver. The king's voice carried through the thick carriage walls, low and laced with lethal promise. "You rejected her for political gain, boy. A foolish, arrogant mistake. Pray to your ancestors that I never require your lands, Crawford. Because if I do, I will remember the mud on her knees." An hour later, the royal vanguard was on the move, thundering away from the Horrington Keep. Genevieve sat huddled beneath a mountain of heavy furs, clutching a goblet of warm, spiced wine Harrison had thrust into her hands. The carriage door opened, letting in a blast of freezing wind before King Nathaniel stepped inside, taking up the entirety of the opposite bench. He had removed his helm and gauntlets. In the dim light of the carriage, the jagged white scar across his face looked even more pronounced. His eyes had returned to their icy blue, but the heavy, volatile aura of his beast still filled the confined space. "Why?" Genevieve whispered, her voice rasping. She clutched the silver goblet like a shield. "I am an exile. I have nothing to offer a king." Nathaniel watched her with a heavy, unreadable expression. Do you know what they call me in the southern territories? Genevieve, the Blood King, she answered, honestly too exhausted to lie. He offered a grim, humorless smile. A fitting title. My inner beast is feral. It was broken during the siege of the Black Rivers 10 years ago. It fights me for control every waking second. For a decade, I have not slept a full night without waking up with blood under my fingernails, my wolf desperate to slaughter everything in the room. He leaned forward, his massive forearms resting on his knees. But when I rode into that courtyard the moment my beast flared to kill, I smelled white ash and petrichor. I smelled you. Genevieve blinked, utterly bewildered. Me. You are an anchor, Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a reverent, almost disbelieving hush. An omega born with the bloodline of the old peacekeepers. A myth I thought died out 3 centuries ago. When I stood 3 feet from you, my beast went completely, entirely silent. For the first time in 10 years, my mind was my own. Genevieve stared at him, the pieces falling into place. He hadn't rescued her out of pity. He hadn't taken her because he desired her. She was a medical necessity, a biological sedative for a mad king. Curiously, instead of feeling used, a strange sense of relief washed over her. She had a purpose. She wouldn't be thrown to the wolves, but the wilderness had other plans. Just past midnight, as the carriage rattled through a narrow mountain pass, a deafening explosion shattered the silence. The carriage violently lurched, throwing Genevieve against the velvet walls. Shouts erupted outside, followed by the terrifying guttural snarls of shifting wolves and the clash of steel. "Rogues!" Nathaniel growled. In a fraction of a second, his human eyes vanished, replaced by a blinding, violent crimson. The feral beast had clawed its way to the surface. He kicked the carriage door entirely off its iron hinges and launched himself into the freezing night. Genevieve crawled to the opening, peering out into the snowy chaos. There were dozens of them, the very scavengers the Harringtons had been fighting, led by a notorious warlord named Wyatt. They had ambushed the king's vanguard in the narrow gorge. Nathaniel was a force of pure devastation. He didn't even shift into his wolf form. He fought with his bare hands and a massive broadsword, ripping through the rogues with a terrifying, bloodthirsty glee. But as he fought, Genevieve saw it. He was losing his mind. He was slaughtering friend and foe indiscriminately, his massive sword swinging toward Commander Harrison. The beast had completely taken over. Without thinking, driven by an instinct older than time, Genevieve threw off her furs. She leaped from the carriage into the bloody, snow-covered gorge. "Nathaniel!" She screamed, her voice cutting through the sounds of battle. The Blood King froze his sword an inch from Harrison's neck. He turned his chest, heaving, covered in gore, his eyes glowing with an unholy red light. He dropped the sword and began stalking toward Genevieve, a feral snarl ripping from his throat. Harrison yelled a warning, but Genevieve stood her ground. As the massive, blood-soaked king loomed over her, preparing to strike, Genevieve reached out. She didn't cower. She pressed her small, pale hand flat against the center of his armored chest, right over his racing heart. "Quiet," she whispered, projecting every ounce of her calm, her sorrow, and her quiet strength into him. The effect was instantaneous. The red light violently snuffed out of Nathaniel's eyes. His knees buckled, and the legendary king collapsed forward, burying his face into her shoulder, inhaling the scent of her neck like a drowning man grasping for air. The remaining rogues, terrified by the display, broke rank and fled into the trees. Nathaniel held her tightly against his ruined armor, his massive frame trembling. "Don't stop!" he begged, his voice breaking. "Please don't let the noise come back." In that bloody, freezing snowbank, the King of the North realized she wasn't just an anchor. The hollow void in Genevieve's chest, the one left by Oliver's rejection, suddenly flared to life, knitting together with a golden, searing heat that locked her soul to the man weeping in her arms. 4 months later, the great hall of the Lancaster stronghold was bathed in the warm, golden light of thousands of beeswax candles. The air smelled of roasting meats, pine, and expensive frankincense. Genevieve sat upon a throne of dark oak and velvet. She was unrecognizable from the mud-caked, shivering girl in the Harrington Keep. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her pale skin, her hair braided with thin strings of silver. Her posture was impeccable, radiating a quiet, absolute authority. The bond with Nathaniel had fully solidified. They were fated mates, a truth that had rocked the kingdoms. He was no longer the feral blood king. He was a fiercely protective, cunning ruler, anchored by the love of his Omega Queen. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned open. Commander Harrison stepped through his boots, clicking against the polished stone floor. "Your Graces," Harrison announced, bowing deeply. "The emissaries from the Harrington pack have arrived. They seek an urgent audience." Nathaniel, seated beside Genevieve, let out a low, dangerous rumble from his chest. He reached over, lacing his massive, scarred fingers through her delicate ones. "Send them in," he commanded. 2 figures were escorted into the hall, looking ragged, desperate, and entirely stripped of their former pride. It was Alpha Reginald Crawford and his son Oliver. The border war had not gone well for the Harringtons. Lady Beatrice of the Ironwood pack had betrayed them the moment the rogue attacks worsened, withdrawing her forces and leaving the Harringtons to be slaughtered by Wyatt's scavengers. They had lost their western farmlands, their armory was depleted, and they were starving. They had come to beg the king for a military intervention. Oliver kept his eyes glued to the floor as they approached the dais. "Your Grace," Reginald began, his voice trembling as he dropped to his knees. "We beseech you. The Ironwood alliance is broken. Wyatt's forces are at our very walls. If Lancaster does not ride to our aid, our pack will be eradicated. You ask for Lancaster blood to spill for your incompetence," Nathaniel asked, his voice echoing coldly in the vast hall. "We ask for mercy, sire," Oliver interjected, finally lifting his head. The moment Oliver's eyes landed on the Queen, the words died in his throat. All the colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He stared at Genevieve, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a horrified, agonizing realization. She was glowing with health, draped in unimaginable wealth, sitting on a throne beside the most powerful man in the known world. And she looked at him with absolute, unwavering indifference. "Good. Genevieve," Oliver whispered, the sheer shock making him forget protocol. Nathaniel leaned forward, his icy blue eyes flashing with a dangerous glint. "You address your queen as her Grace, boy, or I will have Harrison remove your tongue." Oliver immediately dropped to his knees, his forehead pressing against the cold stone floor, trembling violently. The sheer magnitude of his mistake crashed over him. He had rejected his mate, a woman who possessed the power to tame the Blood King for a political alliance that had ultimately destroyed his pack. He had thrown away a diamond to pick up a worthless stone. "You cast out a member of your pack into the winter cold to die." Genevieve spoke. Her voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, resonant, and carried the undeniable weight of a queen. "You broke the sacred laws of the ancestors out of ambition and cruelty." "I was a fool," Oliver sobbed into the floor, the bitter taste of utter regret choking him. "I beg for your forgiveness, your Grace. I beg you to save my people." Genevieve looked at Nathaniel. They communicated silently through their bond, a warm pulse of agreement passing between them. She looked back at the pathetic figures kneeling before her. "The Lancaster army will ride north," Genevieve declared, her voice ringing with finality. "We will crush Wyatt's rogues. We will secure your borders and feed your starving people. For a true leader does not let the innocent suffer for the sins of the cruel." Reginald wept with relief, praising the Queen's mercy. However, Genevieve continued her tone, dropping in temperature, freezing the air in the room. "The Harrington pack requires strong leadership. A man who rejects his fated mate for political convenience is a coward. A coward cannot lead wolves." She looked down at Oliver, her eyes reflecting the cold iron of her crown. "Oliver Crawford, you are hereby stripped of your alpha heir status. You will never rule. You will serve in the vanguard foot soldier infantry until the end of your days. If you refuse, you will be exiled." Oliver gasped a broken, agonizing sound. He had lost everything. His mate, his pride, his birthright, and his future. He remained kneeling, weeping silently, as the full weight of his punishment settled over him. Genevieve leaned back into her velvet throne, her hand held securely in Nathaniel's warm, powerful grip. She was no longer the rejected Omega, shivering in the mud. She was the Crimson Anchor, the Queen of Lancaster. And she had just rewritten the fate of the entire North. Did Genevieve's ultimate revenge leave you speechless? Sometimes the very people we cast aside become the rulers of our destiny. If you loved this tale of betrayal, power, and unexpected romance, hit that like button. Right now, share this video with your fellow fantasy romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic werewolf drama. What would you have done to Oliver? Let us know in the comments below.